Welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. I'm Len Mort.
And I'm Dory Cronin.
And together we bring you informational programs, basically about the history of Millbury and Millbury's people.
We've spent a lot of time in some historical spots in Millbury. One of them was the Asia Waters Mansion.
And we've done programs on the Waters firearms collectibles. And people don't realize that there are a few museums in town. There's museums for just about everything you can imagine. We have the Historical Museum in the center of town.
And we have a few other little spots in town that have some historical value that you guys can stop in and check out.
But what people don't know or realize that right here in the center of town, in Millbury, there is another museum that's kind of right on the main road, but unknown. And tonight, we're going to take you to that museum. And we hope you enjoy the program. Come along with us now while we could take you there. Here we are at a little-known museum right here on Main Street. Not too many people realize that there is a museum in this building. This sign behind us has been here since 1938, which is a piece of history in itself. Come on, let's enter the museum.
Welcome, come in.
Hi,
Hello,
we came to tour your museum.
thank you. Come right in.
Well, we're here with Stuart Mulhane, the owner of the funeral home and the curator of this museum that we're going to bring you people with. Want to take us on?
Sure. In the museum, we have caskets that were used back from 1860 to probably around possibly the late 1800s. And we also have equipment that was used back somewhere between probably 1870 to probably somewhere in the early 1900s. So why don't we first kind of talk to you a little bit about caskets. What we have here is probably, most of your caskets back then were wood. There were very few metal caskets. This is a sealer type casket which you never seen back then. It possibly could be used to send ship bodies a long distance. What would happen is it would unscrew here and the top would come off. The body would be put in, and then these are actual directions from the company that made the casket how to seal it. I would say this could go back to the early 1860s, or caskets like this were used back then. Very seldom did you see a metal casket. This is cast iron. In the casket, if you wanted to step up a little closer, you can actually see inside it does have an interior. The only thing that you've seen of the body was the head. You didn't view the rest of the body. But you can actually see a little pillow in there, and it's fully lined. This would be sealed. When it's in shipment, the top would be put over and screwed down. This is what I call a cold air ice casket. Before embalming was used, we'll talk about that later, how it started. The body would be preserved with ice. Inside, you can see a tray right there. That tray was filled with ice and placed over the cavity of the body, sort of like what we have a cooler today. Mm-hmm. Underneath this tray is another tray that collected the water as the ice melted. And there was a drain in the bottom of the casket that would drain into a bucket, and you would have to keep emptying the bucket and keep filling it with ice, especially in this time of year when it was very warm.
Now that brings us to another subject. They didn't have ice makers back then.
No. But they probably had to use blocks of ice and chip them to fit into this tray. This is how you fill the tray. The only thing that you've seen was the head of the body, and you can see how the tray fits around the neck of the, there's a little teddy bear in there to kind of show you how it used to be. And that's all you've seen. You didn't see anything else. Okay? Now, when it came time for burial, they wouldn't use this casket for burial. This was used for the viewing. It splits right here. You can see the handles. There's two handles. So this whole top comes off. They would take the tray out, and underneath the tray is a carriage with handles, and they would lift the body out of the casket and probably place them in a casket similar to these for burial and services. This would be used for the viewing.
And how long would they normally have somebody there?
Well, it depends on the time of year. In the summertime, it's very difficult in a situation like this because it's not airtight. So, and the ice melts pretty fast. You got to keep, but it's very difficult to say. But, and we'll get into the embalming part of this later. But the bodies did not hold up the way they do today.
Right.
This usually was lined with felt. In other words, the sides were lined with felt, and they would have to change the felt quite often because the bodies would start to break down. But this was the best they had. They had no better. Okay? So what they would do is they would place them in a casket such as these. These are about 1880 caskets. And as you can see, they're made a little bit different. They were very thrifty in those days. If they could save a little wood, they saved a little wood. So the caskets were not large caskets. Now, I'm not sure if this is a full adult, but the adult casket would not be much larger than this. As you can see, it has a full interior, but the interior that we know today kind of comes out and dresses the outside of the casket. These did not. They stayed right inside, and there's a little pillow there too. And back then, what you used to do, most of the caskets were very similar. You didn't have much of a selection back in the 1800s. And you would select handles. This was kind of the way you dressed up a casket. There were different type of handles that you could buy, and that's how you dressed the casket up. So you probably purchased the casket without the handles, and then there was probably a selection of handles. As you can see how the insides are made. So they can bend them. They'd cut the sides so they would bend that piece of wood. There were a lot of children's deaths then also, back in the 1800s, early 1900s. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but these would be child caskets.
The life expectancy back then wasn't very long either.
No, even for adults.
Right, and with diseases and
That's
so a
right.
lot of childhood diseases, many kids didn't
That's
survive.
right.
So.
But they actually had equipment that they would use because there were so many children's deaths. But
There
we'll
were
get-
diseases they hadn't even found a cure for or even started to back then. You know, it was unfortunate.
But
The woodworkers stayed busy though.
That's right, yeah. Woodworkers, I don't think ever got into, they called it undertaking then. They would build the caskets, but they would let other people do the undertaking or the funeral service.
Well, when you look at the work that's done inside the casket in order to bring that curve and make it look so smooth on the outside, I mean,
That's right.
that was a woodworking artist that created those. They didn't have the tools they have today.
That's right.
Right.
And time wasn't as important as the cost of the material. Time wasn't, the cost of the material was the important thing to keep down.
And even the finishes between yesterday and today are totally different from one another. They were very archaic back then. Basically, they used Japan colors, ground Japan colors, and varnish, and coat after coat after coat, and hand rubbed. That's where they came up with the polish on that.
Yeah.
Today, they're using mechanical means and epoxy paints. And there's a great deal of history here.
I think so. But back then, with the ice casket, embalming started to become more popular. Probably became quite popular during the Civil War when doctors would embalm bodies to send them home. I heard they did quite a few of them to send them home, because you'd never be able to send a body home without embalming it.
Right.
Especially with the temperature. Temperature makes a big difference. So probably around after the Civil War, there were vendors, I think, that would sell embalming chemicals of some kind. They probably, as time went on, they probably got into formaldehyde. They probably weren't into formaldehyde when they first started. But from what I understand, these vendors would go around to different people that were undertakers or funeral directors and instruct them how to embalm bodies.
What kind of chemicals did they originally use?
It could have been some type of arsenic or something like that. I'm not quite sure, but they eventually got into formaldehyde. But they would instruct these fellas, and I'm not sure exactly what type of license you needed back then. I know that the state was involved with death certificates and things like this, but as far as becoming a funeral director, you might just have had to, be registered with the state. But they would go around to these people who were interested in embalming bodies, give them some instruction, sell them some fluid, probably give them a certificate, and they were embalmers. Okay.
Sort of like the internet today.
Yeah, close. And this is a kind of an embalming case from probably about 1875, maybe 1880. As you can see, today we have all stainless steel instruments. They had hard rubber. But this would be quite a nice case. There are many different little implements here that they use for different reasons. We don't have to get into that. But this would be a complete embalming case, and underneath they would carry some fluid. I can't lift this up, but underneath they would have a couple bottles of fluid. And they would try to embalm a body. Now, of course, back then, there were not a lot of funeral homes. Most of the visitation or calling hours or wakes were held in the home. And that's where they would embalm the bodies, in the home.
Really?
Yes.
How old would you figure that?
1870, 1880.
It looks in very good condition.
It is. This one probably wasn't used that much. But basically they started embalming bodies. And they'd embalm them in the homes because there were no funeral homes then. Everything was done in the home except the service would be in the church. But all this equipment had to be brought to the home. And the way they did it was, whatever you see here, fold it up into a suitcase type of thing. So you could carry it like a suitcase. Even this here. This is like a day bed. In other words, you could view a body basically right on this bed at the home. Maybe they just wanted a viewing without a casket. And you could do that. The different type of headrests they had then. But out here, to embalm bodies, I can show you the tables that they used. This is a table that they would use to bring to the home to embalm the body. And all this folded up, and you carry it like a suitcase. Here's the handle right here. So it all folds up. And they would actually try to embalm a body on this table. They would probably either use the hand pumps that you see over here, all hard rubber, to pump the fluid into the body. And the reason they have holes in the table was because that would allow the air to come up through the bottom to dry the body and keep it from being damp. The damp body was, see, today we have air conditioning, we have refrigeration. They had nothing, so the damp body would create a situation of possibly breaking down the body sooner or faster.
I noticed that even back then, they have company advertisement
Yeah.
on the table.
It wasn't expensive to do that. To make the table was, the material was the, and this had an adjustable headrest. This was what we used to keep the head in place. And what they would do is they would embalm the body. Now this table here, again folded up, this could be used as a dressing table. In other words, after the body was embalmed, it could be put on this table and dressed. And then placed in a casket. See, once the body was embalmed, you didn't need the ice casket.
Right.
You could just place it in a regular casket for viewing. And then you'd go with the half couch, which is the half open. But as time went on, instead of using the hard rubber pumps, hand pumps, they actually had machines here. Again, it all compressed right into a case to be brought to the home. And this was probably like one of the first electric pumps that they would use to embalm bodies. But again, it would just go down into the case, and you would carry the case to the home. And there was so many child deaths years ago that they actually had child tables for embalming.
So you wouldn't have to take the whole.
You wouldn't have to take the big one, you'd take the small one. But because embalming, and whether they used ice caskets or whatever, especially in the warmer months, they would break down quicker, and you would get odors. And they actually had incense that you would burn in the home. Now this would come out. This is a case to bring it to the house, again, but you would take this out, this would slide right out, and you would burn incense, like we use aerosols today.
Yeah.
Stuart, what is the wicker basket?
Back when they started transferring bodies, probably from the hospitals or maybe the homes to funeral homes, instead of stretchers, this is what they'd use. It was a case where the body would be put inside, and this is the top, and it'd be strapped on, and you can see the handles on each end. So instead of stretchers, they used the wicker baskets to transfer the bodies. This is another ice casket. This is probably handmade. As you can see, again, the place where you'd view the body. And again, you have the trays, which you would fill with ice. And then this splits also. And you can see the equipment that would be underneath that you would lift the body out.
How long did it take you to collect all these pieces?
I started kind of late. You know, we had some here, and believe it or not, I went to yard sales. Brimfield, I picked up some.
Really?
Yes. And through their connections, I was able to get some other pieces. But I started late. I didn't start early. I didn't think about it. Some of the things I waited too long because we stored them away and they weren't good when I went to get them.
That's too bad.
Too bad. But,
There's a great deal of history here, and I'm sure that many of our viewers and their friends and relatives have never given any thought to what took place 50, 100, 200 years ago, and how they transported the individuals, and the type of caskets that were involved, and what was behind those caskets and everything, and the transportation of the deceased during the funeral process. And I find that myself, I think that it's very interesting. How about you, Dora?
I'm still, the ice casket is really bothering me. No, only because it's come so far. I would never even imagine just going to a funeral only viewing the face, because essentially that's all you could see, right?
But they didn't know any better. That's all they ever seen.
Right.
As as time went on. Most of your old caskets are similar to this, where they only have the window.
The cast iron casket.
Well, also they made wooden caskets like that with the window.
Maybe it's because I'm so young that
That's
I don't
right.
remember.
I don't remember it. My father does remember going to different homes with his father to help him bound bodies. And in the back of his mind, he's dead now, but in the back of his mind, he does remember the ice casket being used at times. And that had been probably somewhere between 1915, 1920 area. Because a lot of the people forgot about the bucket underneath, and it kind of overflowed. He remembers that.
A lot of us can
That
remember
happened.
seeing movies, back in time, whether it was in the hills of Appalachia or even other movies of the sharecroppers and the people during the Depression passing away, and you'd see in those films generally a funeral in the home, and you didn't give much thought to that, but it's kind of hard to comprehend that they died in the home. The funeral director came to the home and prepared them in the home, waked them in the home, and everything was done right there. As a matter of fact, I would imagine that during the wake, they were serving dinner.
Oh, sure. When you went to the home, you were very much welcomed, and certainly they had food and drink for you.
I just can't imagine them, setting a sandwich on the coffin,
The prayer cards that we use today, the small card with the prayer on it, this is what they did years ago. Look at the detail to this. This was probably all hand done
That's beautiful.
with the name on it.
Those are pretty.
A lot of work went into those.
That's right, individual. Then over here we have people like keepsakes. So a lot of times what they did was, as we have today with cremation, we have different jewelry that you can purchase that would have a thumbprint on it, or maybe some cremains in a piece of jewelry. Back then, of course, they didn't have cremation back then. They would actually make little pins, and these were made from the hair of the deceased.
Wow.
As you can see this one a little bit better. See the hair?
Oh, yeah.
And they would wear them.
How long ago was that?
I don't know. What's happening is a lot of these things are coming through auctions and things like this from old homes that they're cleaning out. These, I forget where I got these, but it must have come from some type of auction or something, because they're not from here. Back in 1872 when we first started, and I think we have some pictures of those, a total funeral in 1872, and it's an original bill from Dennis Mulhane, which was my great-grandfather. The total funeral was $22. That included casket, everything they had in. Now the body probably wasn't embalmed back then. It included the opening of the grave of $2. They actually opened the grave by hand for $2. And the other one was for $26. That was the first one, because they bought probably an 8-grave lot for $6 in the cemetery.
My wife wanted me to ask you, when she goes, did she have her funeral for that same price?
Sure. If you paid for it back then, you could. But as we go along, like this one is John J. Mulhane, that's my grandfather. Total funeral in 1940 was $344. Here's John's 1929. Here's one for $232. Here's one 1923 for $136. And here's one, this is from another funeral home, from Sessions Funeral Home in Worcester. Back in 1918 was $180. So as you can see, I mean, the same funeral here as today, you're probably talking $8,000. Cemetery, everything included, but probably up around $8,000, where you were down $232 then. But that was a lot of money then. In 1872, $22 was probably, well, a couple months' work.
Yeah.
You know, probably.
How things have changed.
But basically the funerals haven't changed a lot. It's just the way that we go about doing it. The merchandise we use, the equipment we use. I mean, today the embalming process is completely different. People expect a lot more. Back then, they were glad just to be able to look in this window and see the head of the body. Today that has changed a lot.
And I'm sure that regulations today have made a big change
Sure.
in the funeral process.
Yes. It would not, this type of preservation, this type of viewing today, I mean, for health reasons alone, would be not acceptable.
And I would imagine back then they had more time to prepare the body, whereas usually you guys are ready within a few days, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But today we have the special room, the preparation room, which has all the equipment, all modern equipment. We're able to do so much more in less time. I mean, back then it was very difficult to embalm a body at home. But we have the equipment today, the tables, everything necessary. Makes a big difference. I wouldn't want to, I never embalmed a body in a home. I never would want to try to do it. It couldn't have been done the way that they would want it to be done. Yes, it did preserve the body somewhat, but it wasn't completely the way it should be.
And today that wouldn't be allowed anyway, I would imagine.
No, you couldn't embalm a body in a home today. No. No, they're very strict. Very strict. The licensing, who can be there for the embalming, who can do the embalming. It's all done, it's very strict, the licensing procedure.
And this is amazing because it's a profession that goes way back in time.
Yes,
So,
it does. And it's been improving ever since the 1860s.
and I'm just glad to say that, I can be here, and I took your tour once before of what you have here, and it's great that you took the time to have an interest in collecting this and willing to show it.
I do. I've even talked about at the time of my death just donating it to the National Museum.
Now, if somebody wants to come and take a look at this stuff in person,
They're very welcome. Just a call to the funeral home, or maybe stop in, you know, if we have the time. Because we do like to come up with them, kind of describe the different caskets, different equipment to them a little bit, and then let them go from there.
A personal explanation is far greater than the placards that you have here.
That's right.
You give a little more in-depth idea of what took place and how they were used and the history of them. You know.
Yes.
Could you explain a little about your hearse here?
Be glad to, Lenny. This horse-drawn hearse was made in Massachusetts by the SCP's company. Approximate date on it is 1880 to 1890. It is a duplicate of what Mulhane had in that period. It's pulled by 2 horses. Inside, it has a trap door, so you can wash the glass from the inside. In other words, you would climb under the car, under the hearse, open the door, and you'd stand just like this inside the vehicle. And you can wash the windows. There's a little opening here. It has, for the stops on the casket, all caskets were wood at that time, so there's a mechanism inside that if you throw the crank, pins come up and they go into the bottom of the casket, and that holds the casket in place. The little holders on the side hold it from going sideways and also from back and forth.
Are those movable?
Yes, they are. In other words, if you had a smaller casket, whether it be a child, a teenager, or a full adult, you can move those to hold the casket. There's places to put them. This hearse will hold a standard casket of today. Some of the hearses that you see, the horse-drawn hearses, that go back to about the 1860s, are shorter, because people back then were shorter. They will not hold a standard casket of today. So any casket that's made today, unless it's oversized, will fit in this vehicle. As you notice, the rollers inside are thin. One of the reasons for that is all the wood caskets at that time, that's the only type of casket they had, was flat. If we use a metal casket in this hearse, we have to put another set of rollers that are wider, because if we put a metal casket in, these rollers could get caught in the ribs of the bottom and you wouldn't be able to get it out. So we can do either.
Now the lanterns that are on this hearse, were those oil lamps or originally?
They were originally,
carbon
yes, and those aren't the original lanterns that Mulhane had, and the ones that Mulhane had probably were a lot more detailed than these, but they were all oil lamps. There was no electricity on these at all.
Now this is not just a good-looking piece of antiquity, but you have actually used this.
Yes, we have. Anyone that requests it, we can use it. If the situation presents itself that we can trailer this to different locations. Basically, we have used it for different purposes. We did use it. We brought it down to the National Cemetery in Bourne. They found a Civil War veteran buried down south when they were excavating for a restaurant. and the military took over, and they brought him up here because certain identification on the body was preserved quite well because it was buried in clay, so the air didn't get to it. So it had Massachusetts belts on him. We know it was a younger soldier, but he did come from Massachusetts, so they brought him back, and we brought this hearse down to bury the first Civil War veteran in the National Cemetery down in Bourne. They had quite a ceremony.
You also used it here in Millbury.
We have used it on occasions. Years ago for a former police chief. We have used it for private parties, horsemen that are into horses, situations like that.
It's an absolutely beautiful piece to see close up.
Well, thank you.
Stuart, would you explain this vehicle?
Yes. This is a 1923 Model T hearse. Basically, it was when engines came about, the conversion from the horse-drawn to the motorized hearse. Basically, I think the first conversions were they would have a Model T hearse, or a hearse, an older hearse, or a truck model, and they would take the back of this and put it on the truck. And as time went on, they seen the need for motorized hearses. So that's when companies started to build these vehicles. Now, the vehicle itself was made in Canada by Henry Ford. It is the factory he had in Canada. It is marked so on the block of the engine and is marked on the vehicle itself. It is a Model TT truck. And basically back then what they did was you bought the truck body, just the bottom part, and you built your own cab and you built whatever type of vehicle that you needed. Basically, this was built by someone in Canada. It's the wood on the side is hand carved. Bass wood from what we understand, but it was hand carved. Some of the bottom has been replaced, but this is all original. The hand carving is all original. This will also fit a standard casket of today. So basically, both of these vehicles can be used for standard caskets of today. If the request is there, they can be used. The Model T part of this is a different type of running gear where you have belts instead of a transmission. Inside you can see the pedals on the floor. There are 3 pedals to run this vehicle. The left pedal is forward low gear, forward high gear, and neutral. The middle pedal can be used, well, it is used for reverse, but it also can be used for a brake. In other words, if you're going forward, you can brake the vehicle with that middle pedal, or you can use the right pedal for the brake. This also has the Ruxto rear end. In other words, it has a low-speed rear end and a high-speed rear end. And that's controlled by the tall stick, which is located in the middle of the vehicle here.
There's not a great deal of room in the cab for...
No, there isn't. What's very interesting to me is when people move from the horse-drawn vehicle to the motorized vehicle, what a transition that must have been. It must have felt great to be able to get in and start an engine and go where you gotta go. Instead of...
Especially in the rain.
That's right.
Well, one thing I notice is it seems like, especially that horse-drawn carriage, is more elegant almost compared to this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you notice that was that transition for a while that
It could have been, yeah.
people wanted more simple, more quiet? Because that just seems
Yes.
more elaborate.
It is, and there are other horse-drawn vehicles that are more elaborate than that. That's basically a simple type of horse-drawn vehicle.
Really, it's beautiful.
There's a lot more detail to a lot of them. but that's a simple one.
Notice the windows don't have handles to raise and lower them.
No. This vehicle has no windshield wipers. It has no rear tail, it has one rear tail light, no brake lights. It doesn't really have a braking system that we know of today. This is original. It doesn't have the disc brakes. It has the bands to stop it. And if the bands break, you're in trouble.
When was the last time you've used this?
On a funeral, it's been a little while. A lot of people don't realize we have them, but they are available. This one's very easy to use on a local funeral. This one is quite a bit difficult. It takes a lot of time with horses and transporting horses. Where this, you just can back it out, do the funeral.
We leave each program with words of wisdom. Today's words of wisdom are, all the treasure in the world is worthless unless you have someone to share it with. Until next time.